I am 77 years old now, and the winters feel heavier than they used to, as if the cold itself remembers what I've tried so hard to forget. When the wind slips through these cracked window frames and rattles the old tin roof, it carries echoes from a night I've kept buried for 30 years. People like to say age softens memories, round them down like stones in a river, but some memories don't soften at all. Some remain sharp enough to draw blood, and some, if they belong to a creature you loved, never stop following you. I have carried a secret cross most of my life, a secret born in a blizzard that should have taken me too, and now, with my hands trembling against this old stove, I feel it pressing against me again. If I don't speak now, I never will. Back in the winter of '92, I was a different woman. 47, widowed too young, stubborn enough to choose solitude over pity. I'd come to that mountain cabin because the world felt too loud after my husband died, and grief had a way of making every small kindness unbearable. Up there, the forest didn't ask anything of me. The pines didn't judge, the snow didn't whisper condolences, and the quiet gave me room to breathe. I chopped my own wood, hauled my own water, and learned to sleep with the sound of branches snapping under the weight of deep winter. Every day tasted of smoke and cold iron, and every night felt like I was keeping vigil with ghosts. The blizzard came early that year, rolling over the ridgeline like a wall of white fury. By noon the sky had vanished, swallowed whole. By dusk the world had narrowed to the reach of my lantern and the sound of my own breath. The cold was so fierce it bit through my coat, stinging my cheeks until they burned. I remember thinking the storm sounded almost alive, howling through the trees as if warning the living to hide. I had just stepped out to check the traps along the lower trail, a foolish habit I should have broken by then, when I heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm at all. It was soft, strangled, almost musical in its desperation. For a moment I thought it was an injured fawn, but something in the tone stopped me. It sounded like a child. My boots sank deep into the drifts as I followed the sound, each step heavier than the last. The lantern swung in my hand, throwing nervous shadows up the trees. I remember tasting iron in the air, feeling fear collect in my throat like cold smoke. Just as I reached a fallen cedar near the bend of the trail, the wind shifted, and I saw a small shape curled in the snow. At first glance, it looked like a bundle of fur snagged on a broken branch, but then it moved, just barely, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. Kneeling beside it, I brushed snow from its face. That was the moment my life split into before and after. What I found wasn't human, though its eyes, half open, glazed with cold, held a plea I recognized instantly. The creature was small, maybe the size of a human toddler, its fur matted with ice, its limbs trembling violently. Its fingers, yes, fingers, twitched toward me as if reaching for warmth it could no longer feel. Something inside me, something maternal, I thought had died with my husband and the children we never had, surged to the surface. I should have run. I should have feared it. Instead, I pressed my coat around its tiny frame, feeling its fragile ribs beneath the fur, and lifted it into my arms. It weighed less than I expected, less than any living thing should in such cold, and when it let out a faint, broken whimper, I felt my heart fracture in a way I hadn't felt in years. The wind nearly knocked me over as I turned back toward the cabin, cradling the creature tight against my chest. Snow stung my eyes, blurred my steps, fought to steal the lantern light from me. Each breath felt like shards of glass cutting down my throat. I kept talking to it as I stumbled through the drifts, nonsense words, anything to keep it tethered to this world. By the time I reached my door, my arms were numb from holding it, and the creature's shivering had grown dangerously weak. Inside, the cabin was warm but dim, lit only by the stove's glow and a single flickering oil lamp. I laid the creature near the fire, brushing frost from its fur, feeling my pulse thrum with fear and responsibility. Steam rose from its body as the ice began to melt, curling around us like mist from a dream. Its eyes opened fully then, dark, wide, shimmering with confusion and fear, and for a heartbeat, the world felt utterly silent. I don't know what it saw in me at that moment, but whatever it was, it made the creature reach out and grip my wrist with strength that startled me. The message in its touch was unmistakable. Don't leave me. I wrapped it in blankets, fed it warm broth droplet by droplet, and stayed by its side long into the night. The snow piled against the windows, wind shook the chimney, and still I didn't move. Watching it breathe, shallow, uncertain, but alive, stirred something fierce and protective inside me. I had found a living impossibility in the snow, and instead of fear, I felt purpose. A purpose I hadn't felt in years. But near dawn, just as I began to doze in my chair, something outside cracked through the storm, loud, sharp, deliberate. The creature flinched, eyes snapping open, and for the first time since finding it, I saw pure terror flood its face. That was the moment I realized the blizzard hadn't hidden us. Something out there had followed us through the dark, and it was still searching. For days after the blizzard, I barely left the creature's side, afraid that if I stepped too far from the fire, it might slip away unnoticed into whatever darkness it had crawled out of. There was a strange peace in those early hours, a rhythm between its shallow breaths and the slow crackling of the stove, as if the cabin itself were holding its breath with me. I carried memories of my husband's final winter, like stones in my pockets, heavy and cold, but tending to this fragile being eased the weight just enough for me to breathe without wincing. It felt strange to admit, even to myself, that its survival mattered to me more than my own at times. Loneliness does that to a person, especially one who's been running from it for half a lifetime. It grew stronger faster than I expected. Within a week, the creature could sit upright, though it wobbled like a toddler finding its legs for the first time. Its fur fluffed out again, no longer clumped with frost, and its eyes, dark and wet like polished obsidian, followed me everywhere. When I chopped vegetables for stew, it mimicked the movement with invisible tools. When I stoked the fire, it reached toward the flames as if trying to understand their warmth. Each gesture felt like a thread stitching itself quietly into the fabric of my life, closing holes I hadn't realized were still bleeding. But with its growing strength came signs of something deeper, intelligence, curiosity, and a strange emotional sensitivity that unnerved me. It watched my face closely, mirroring expressions with uncanny accuracy. When I winced at an old knee injury flaring up, it limped the next hour until I laughed despite the ache. That laugh startled us both. I hadn't heard it echo off these cabin walls since before my husband died. The creature paused, wide-eyed, almost proud of itself, and for a moment I felt a warm spread in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. I tried not to name it. Naming things makes them permanent, makes them yours in ways you can never undo. But one morning, when it tugged gently at my sleeve, coaxing me toward the window where sunlight fractured across the snow, I whispered, "Little one." It tilted its head, listening to the sound, then placed its hand over my heart as if giving permission. After that, the name felt less like a choice and more like a promise. Despite my efforts to keep our world small, the outside began pressing in. The blizzard cleared, revealing tracks along the far side of my property. Deep, wide, and too deliberate to belong to deer or elk. Someone else had been out there that night, and perhaps more than once. I didn't tell the little one, though it already sensed my unease. It hovered near me whenever I stepped outside, eyes darting to the tree lean as if remembering something it had hoped to forget. Sometimes at dusk, it would press its forehead to the window and let out a low hum that made my skin prickle. There was longing in that sound and fear. One evening, as the sky bruised in the twilight, I heard boots crunching over crusted snow, human steps, steady, heavy, searching. My pulse hammered in my ears. The little one froze, then scrambled under the table, curling into a trembling knot of fur. I grabbed a rifle I rarely used and stepped onto the porch. A pair of hunters stood near the tree line, their breath fogging in the cold. They asked if I'd heard anything unusual during the storm, calls, shadows, movement. Their eyes scanned past me, lingering too long on the shuttered windows. I lied without hesitation, claiming the storm had deafened everything except the wind. When they finally left, the little one crawled out slowly, pressing its small hand to my knee as if thanking me for something far larger than a lie. Days passed with the tension coiling tighter around us. I could feel danger circling, patient and deliberate. At night, the little one began waking in fits, releasing soft, terrified chirps that rattled my nerves. I held it close until it quieted, feeling its small heart hammering against my chest like a trapped bird. I told myself these moments were temporary, that once it gained full strength, it would return to whatever place it came from, and my life would settle back into its old, predictable emptiness. But each time I thought of that future, something inside me recoiled. I'd spent so many years building walls around my grief that I hadn't expected a creature, an impossible, wild thing, to slip through the cracks. The shift began slowly. The little one followed me outside more often, tugging my coat to pull me toward places it remembered. The creek bed, the grove of pines, the ridge where storms gathered. It taught me small sounds, clicks, hums, gentle trills, each one layered with meaning. I learned to feel rather than understand. In return, I taught it how to tie knots, how to warm its hands over the stove without scorching fur, how to listen for the distant rumble of approaching weather. We made an unspoken pact. We would protect each other from the cold, from hunger, from the world beyond the tree lean. Yet with every shared moment, I felt the truth creeping closer. This bond wasn't built to last. I could see it in the way the little one stared at the forest with a longing that tightened my throat. It didn't belong inside walls. It didn't belong to a life marked by grief and aging joints and a woman too stubborn to admit she was lonely. It belonged to something larger, wilder, older than anything I could ever touch. The night everything shifted, I woke to silence. Deep, unnatural silence. The little one wasn't beside the hearth. Panic surged through me as I searched the cabin, calling softly, then louder. When I stepped outside, the moon cast a pale glow across the snow, and there, near the tree lean, the little one stood facing the darkness as if listening to a distant call. Its posture was rigid, frightened, torn between two worlds. I could feel the air thickening with something unseen. I whispered its name, my name for it, the one that had become a thread binding us together. It turned toward me slowly, eyes wide with sorrow, and raised a trembling hand. Before I could take a step, a branch snapped somewhere deep in the woods. Sharp, purposeful, close. The little one flinched, then pressed itself into my arms with a desperation I'd never felt from before. That was the moment I realized we were no longer alone out there, and whatever was searching for us had finally found our trail. I didn't understand, not fully, what that snap in the woods meant, but the little one did. Its body trembled against mine, and for the first time since the night I saved it, I saw something raw and ancient flicker in his eyes. Instinct, memory, fear of something larger than the storm that had nearly taken its life. That fear settled into my bones long after the creature slipped away from my arms and vanished into the darkness. By morning, the forest held no trace of it, only silence. That silence would become the companion of the next 30 years, a presence just as real as the creature itself, and sometimes just as heavy. The cabin felt hollow without its small footsteps pattering across the floor. I found myself turning to check the hearth for its shape curled in sleep, listening for its soft hums woven through the wind. When those sounds failed to return, the loneliness hit harder than it ever had before. Grief does not always announce itself gently. Sometimes it settles on your shoulders like snow you never saw falling. I tried to convince myself that the little one had returned to where it belonged, that the forest had reclaimed what the storm had nearly stolen. But a small part of me wondered if something else had taken it, something that had been hunting the night. It hid beneath my table. Seasons passed, each one leaving its mark on me. My hair silvered, my hands stiffened, and the land around me grew quieter as the years thinned the nearby towns. But I stayed, not out of stubbornness, though I had plenty of that, but because a promise, unspoken but real, held me here. I could not leave the place where the little one had lived, laughed, learned, and trembled. Some bonds refused to fade, even when stretched thin across decades. Every so often, the silence broke in ways that made my heart stumble. A tree bent in an unnatural arc near the creek. Stones arranged in a small pattern beside my woodpile. No footprints, no shadows, no sound of heavy steps in the night. Just faint, deliberate signs that felt like messages left by hands I once held between my own. The first time I found one of those signs, a warmth spread through me so quickly I sat down right there in the snow, clutching the stones as if they might vanish. I whispered to the empty air, asking if it was truly him. Of course, no voice answered. But the message was clear enough. I was not forgotten. Years rolled by. marked by winters that seemed colder than the ones before them. I learned to live with the ache that came from not knowing whether he still breathed under those towering pines. Sometimes I caught sight of silhouettes on distant ridgelines, tall, massive, unmoving. Too far to call out to, too still to be certain they were real. My pulse always quickened, yet by the time I reached for my lantern or rifle, the figure was gone. Whether those shapes were real or born of longing, I never knew. But hope, I learned, is its own kind of survival. It wasn't until the early 2000s that the world began to press against my quiet exile again. Survey crews appeared, followed by men who didn't look like hunters or rangers. They carried equipment I didn't recognize and asked questions that felt too pointed. Had I heard strange calls at night? Had I noticed disturbances in the tree lines? Had I seen anything unusual during storms? Their eyes lingered on me the way a trapper watches an animal decide which path to take. I lied, of course. Years of guarding a secret had taught me how, but their presence stirred an old fear, one I hadn't felt since the night the little one pressed itself into my arms, shaking. Not long after they left, I found fresh impressions in the mud near the lower trail, broad, deep, unmistakable. My breath caught as I knelt beside them. My fingers fit inside the prints like a memory slipping into place. Larger now, of course. Stronger. A grown creature leaving marks where a frightened child once clung to life in my cabin. I touched the edges of the print and felt tears gather at the corners of my eyes. He remembered me. He had come back. Or perhaps he had never truly left. I built a small garden in those years, more out of habit than need, but I often sensed something watching from the shadows beyond the fence. Not threatening, just present, observing. I spoke aloud sometimes, pretending I was simply talking to myself, but part of me hoped the wind would carry my words to the trees where he might be listening. I told the empty woods about my failing knees, about the winter that took my last goat, about the loneliness that never quite surrendered. But mostly, I thanked the forest for keeping him safe. Whether he was out there or not, the gratitude soothed something hollow inside me. Once, on a cold autumn evening, I heard a low call drift through the valley, deep and mournful. It wasn't a wolf, nor any animal I'd heard in my 70 years. It echoed in my chest like a memory answering itself. I stepped onto the porch, clutching the railing as tears blurred the tree lean. I whispered his name, the one I had given him in a moment of tenderness I never expected to last, and the call faded into the dusk. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, dense, expectant, as if the forest were holding its breath again. And then in the winter of 2022, when snow piled deep against the cabin and the wind returned with the same old bitterness it held 30 years before, I heard footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate, impossible. Not the clatter of hunters' boots, not the cautious tread of deer. These steps belonged to something that walked with memory. My heart pounded so hard I feared it might break free of my chest. Slowly, with hands trembling from age and fear and hope tangled together, I opened the door. There, standing in the swirling snow, was a figure taller than any man I'd ever seen, broad-shouldered, for dusted with frost, eyes glowing softly in the lantern light. Eyes I knew, eyes that had once searched my face for safety. But before I could speak his name, before I could breathe his presence in fully, I saw movement behind him, shadows slipping between the trees, closing in, and in that instant, I understood he hadn't come to revisit the past. He had come to warn me of what was finally catching up to us. The night he returned, the snow fell away that 30 years earlier. Thick, feverish, alive. When I stepped out onto the porch, lantern trembling in my hand, he stood there as if carved from the storm itself. Taller now, broad as a tree trunk, for rippling in the wind, yet his eyes were unchanged. Dark, gentle, achingly familiar. For a moment, I forgot the years between us. I forgot the fear that had chased me into old age. All I saw was a little one I had once held by the fire, staring back at me with a tenderness I had not felt from any living creature in decades. But the reunion lasted only a breath before he turned sharply toward the tree lean, issuing a low warning rumble that vibrated through my ribs. That was when I noticed the shapes moving in the dark, silent, coordinated, purposeful. He stepped closer to me, towering over the porch as though shielding me from the cold itself. His arm lowered, urging me back inside. I obeyed not because I was afraid, but because I trusted him the way he had once trusted me. Inside, the cabin seemed to shrink around us, the walls too thin to protect against whatever shadows prowled outside. He crouched to enter, the doorframe barely containing him, and the warmth of the room glowed across the frost in his fur. He touched my shoulder gently, an echo of the gesture he'd made as a child, hand to my heart, as if to say he remembered everything. Before I could speak, a sharp mechanical hum sliced through the night. It wasn't wind. It wasn't the crack of branches. It was the sound of machines, drones, searching, scanning. My breath hitched. He stiffened, then moved away from the window, positioning himself between me and the outside world. I realized then that whatever he had faced out there had driven him back to me not out of longing, but necessity. When the first spotlight swept across the snow, he let out a low, guttural warning. I hadn't heard that sound since he was small, trembling beneath my table during a hunter's approach. But this fear was different, older, heavier. I watched his muscles coil as footsteps crunched toward the cabin. Human voices carried through the storm, sharp with urgency. They weren't hunters. They were something worse, men who came not for survival or sport, but for capture. The door shuddered under a sudden knock. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The men outside called my name, claiming they needed to search the property, insisting they'd receive reports of large hominid activity. My voice shook as I lied through the door, telling them they were mistaken, that nothing unusual had happened in years. Their silence afterward felt like a verdict. The latch rattled. He moved before I could. In a single motion, he lifted me, placing me behind him with the gentleness of a parent protecting a child. His massive frame blocked the entire doorway, just as it was splintered open. The cold rushed in with the men, 3 of them dressed in dark tactical gear, rifles raised. They froze at the sight of him, and for a long, suspended moment, no one breathed. Then the first dart fired. It struck his shoulder with a soft thump, burying itself deep. He staggered, but remained upright. Another dart followed, then a third. I screamed for them to stop, my voice raw, but the men kept firing as if fear had stripped him of reason. He roared, not in anger, but in pain, and the sound cracked something inside me. He swung his arm, knocking the rifles aside as though they were twigs. The men stumbled back, slipping in the snow, scrambling to reload. He turned to me then, eyes glazed, determined, and extended his hand. I took it without hesitation. He lifted me, cradling me against his chest, and leapt through the broken doorway into the raging storm. The world blurred into white and wind as he carried me toward the forest, each stride slower than the last as the tranquilizers burned through his veins. I begged him to leave me, to save himself, but he only held me tighter, as if the memory of me pulling him from the blizzard had never faded. By the time we reached the old cedar grove, his steps had become unsteady. He lowered me gently beneath a massive tree, whose branches shielded us from the biting wind. Snowflakes clung to his fur, like stars dimming one by one. When he sank to his knees, I rushed to steady him, but his enormous frame trembled under my hands. He pressed his palm to my chest again, the same gesture from when he was small, and in that touch I felt gratitude, sorrow, and a love that crossed 30 years of silence. I whispered that I was sorry. Sorry for bringing him into my world. Sorry for every danger he had faced because of it. He blinked slowly, as if telling me none of that mattered. His breath grew shallow. The darts had done their work. I held his face in my hands, feeling the warmth ebbing. Snow fell silently around us, blanketing the ground in white, as though preparing a resting place. When his eyes finally closed, a sound escaped me that I had not made since my husband died, a sound pulled from the deepest part of grief. I had buried my face in his fur, begging him not to go, but his chest had stilled. The forest swallowed my cries. Minutes, maybe hours, passed before I sensed movement. Shadows emerged between the trees, tall and massive, their forms powerful but gentle. They approached slowly, surrounding us with an almost reverent stillness. One of them touched my shoulder as softly as he once had. I understood then. They had come for him, not the men, but his own kind. They lifted him with care and carried him into the deeper woods, disappearing into the storm until the night reclaimed him entirely. When the men arrived, weapons raised, they found only an old woman collapsed in the snow. They demanded answers, but I had none left to give. I told them I knew nothing. And for once, the lie tasted like truth. He was beyond their reach now, somewhere the world could never scar him again. As the storm quieted, a distant call drifted across the valley, low, mournful, familiar. Not a goodbye, a promise, a reminder that even in the red-stained snow of that night, something sacred had taken root. And as I listened, trembling in the cold dawn, I understood that love like ours does not disappear. It simply retreats into the trees, waiting to be remembered. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.